The asylum stood like a stone fortress against the endless sweep of Illinois fields, its spires rising into the gray sky as though meant to pierce heaven itself. To the towns beyond its walls, it was a monument to progress, a sanctuary for the weak, a place where madness could be met with mercy. Politicians praised its opening in 1872 as a triumph of compassion, promising families that their loved ones would find peace within its guarded halls. Mothers signed their sons away with trembling hands. Widows surrendered husbands broken by war, and orphans were delivered as if into safety. Yet the first step inside was never the beginning of healing, but the slow erasure of a life. The tall gates clanged shut behind them, and the clerk at the desk slid their records into a locked drawer. By nightfall, the papers were taken below and fed to fire, leaving only ash drifting through hidden chimneys. Names dissolved into smoke. The living were already forgotten. From the outside, the asylum played its role perfectly. Carriages arrived with banners of reform, the director smiling for photographs with state officials, sermons praising its Christian duty echoing through county churches. To see its marble entrance, one would never imagine that silence, not care, was its first prescription. Patients were led down polished corridors into cells lined with brick and iron. They were told their illnesses would be studied, their grief cured. But the halls were designed less as wards than as corridors of disappearance, doors shut without echo, padded walls smothered voices, and windows sat higher than any gaze could reach. Even the footsteps of nurses seemed rehearsed to avoid sound, as though the building itself conspired to bury each cry before it could escape. The families who delivered their loved ones were reassured with letters of thanks, but those letters were written by a practiced secretary, not by the patients themselves. The truth was that once the gates closed, a person's existence was no longer their own. Their identity was stripped piece by piece, replaced by numbers etched onto ledgers that few would ever see. The asylum was not a place of healing, but of ritual, an experiment disguised as mercy. And at its center was a man whose calm presence concealed an appetite for methodical cruelty. Dr. Erasmus Alcott had built the asylum as a shrine not to medicine, but to his own philosophy, that the human soul could only be understood when broken deliberately, slowly, and without escape. He began not with blood, but with silence. Silence was his first weapon, his favored instrument. He believed that noise protected the mind, that even in madness the voice gave shape to the self. So he set out to remove sound. Patients were forbidden to speak in corridors, nurses trained to signal rather than speak, meals served without words. The silence grew heavier with each passing day, pressing into the chest like a stone. Some began to whisper to themselves out of desperation, only to be dragged into basement rooms where whispers were punished with isolation. Alcott's journals would later record with chilling satisfaction that the absence of sound softened the will, making patients malleable, stripping them of their last defense against despair. The first deaths inside the asylum were not from disease or neglect, but from this silence. A young woman from Springfield, once admitted for grief after her child's death, was found lying on her cot with her own tongue torn in half between her teeth. She had bitten down in the night until blood filled her lungs, desperate to feel the sound she could no longer make. Another man, a veteran who had survived the Civil War, collapsed against the stone wall of his cell, his skull fractured where he had slammed his head again and again, not in madness, but in rage at a silence he could not endure. Each death was recorded not as suicide or accident, but erased entirely. The letters sent to families told of peaceful recovery and discharge. They were never told that their loved ones were buried in unmarked earth behind the asylum, their voices forever cut away. In these opening months, the asylum became a crucible where despair was reshaped into obedience. Alcott learned from each death, refining his methods with a cold precision. Where silence alone was not enough, he began to prepare other rituals, more elaborate, more cruel, each designed to dismantle identity piece by piece. But even at this early stage, the foundation of horror was already laid. It was not the screams of torture that haunted those halls, but their absence. For in the Asylum of 1872, every voice was extinguished, every name burned, and every memory folded into silence so complete it became its own kind of death. And in that silence, Alcott found his beginning. Dr. Erasmus Alcott was a man who seemed born for admiration. He moved through the parlors of Illinois high society with polished grace, his voice gentle, his manners flawless. Judges praised him as a man of progress, governors welcomed his advice on public health, and preachers quoted his words from pulpits as though he were the very image of Christian reform. His portrait, stiff and dignified, even reached the halls of Washington, a gift delivered to President Ulysses S. Grant as a symbol of Midwestern advancement. To those who looked upon him, Alcott was the physician of a new age, a man who had brought order to the chaos of madness. Yet beneath the calm smile he wore for cameras and society dinners was a vision born not of healing but of hunger. He believed the human soul could not be reached through mercy, only through destruction. Alcott's philosophy began with the assumption that pain was the most honest form of truth. He whispered to allies that the soul revealed itself only when the body was stripped of its defenses. To him, despair was not an illness to be cured, but a raw material to be harvested, reshaped, and refined. Patients admitted to the asylum were never seen as men and women in need of care, but as vessels to be drained of all illusions. He believed suffering could be purified into something greater, and he saw himself as the architect of that transformation. Every ritual, every method was designed to strip away layers of humanity until only the raw core of existence remained, exposed and trembling. Behind locked doors, he began to refine his practices, each one crafted with a scientist's precision and a priest's ritual. Some victims were starved not to death but to weakness, fed only enough to keep their hearts beating while their minds sank into hallucinatory states. Others were forced to repeat the same gestures endlessly, lifting stones, folding sheets, bowing their heads in prayer, until muscles collapsed and bones splintered under the weight of obedience. Alcott did not simply want to break bodies, he wanted to capture the exact moment when the will snapped, when resistance turned to surrender. He wrote of these moments in his private journals with the fascination of a man studying rare specimens, noting the tilt of the head, the final breath, the way eyes dulled into emptiness. His most favored method was the orchestration of ritual silence, first tested in Chapter 1's early months, but now expanded into broader experiments. He believed silence was not only a condition but a blade, one that sliced through memory and identity. Patients who resisted the hush were punished in ways that echoed both science and sacrament. Some were fitted with crude wooden clamps that forced jaws shut for days until the flesh of the lips began to rot. Others were confined in padded cells where their own breath became the loudest sound, driving them into frenzies of self-harm. Those who perished in these experiments were quietly buried, their deaths written off as recoveries followed by release. Families received letters penned in his careful hand, describing progress that never existed. Each lie was crafted as tenderly as a prayer. The asylum staff grew accustomed to this dual life. Nurses who showed doubt were reassigned to the most harrowing wards until their own sanity bent under the strain. Guards who resisted orders were dismissed in silence, their reputations stained by whispered accusations of drunkenness or incompetence. Soon none dared question the methods, for Alcott's presence carried the weight of both authority and righteousness. He spoke of his work as though it were a holy mission, declaring that the world outside was too fragile, too sentimental to confront the truths he uncovered. In his mind, he was not a murderer but a reformer of the soul, a man whose task was so sacred that only he could bear its burden. Every death inside the asylum was part of his vision, each methodical and devastating, each one feeding his growing conviction that he had glimpsed a secret no other physician dared touch. When a young boy admitted for night terrors drowned in a shallow basin after being held beneath water until his thrashing ceased, Alcott wrote that he had washed fear into final clarity. When an elderly widow collapsed after days of forced fasting, he noted with approval that her last words were a muttered prayer, as though starvation had refined her faith. For Alcott, suffering was evidence, pain was scripture. Death itself was the purest experiment, a final page in his hidden doctrine. In the public eye, he remained the benevolent director who gave speeches about the sanctity of care, his voice trembling with emotion as he described his dear patients. But in the shadows of his own asylum, his true work unfolded with increasing precision, each ritual tightening the grip of silence, each experiment pushing further toward the abyss. He was a man admired for innocence, yet driven by a vision that made innocence impossible. And with every life extinguished under his careful hand, he grew more certain that he was closer than anyone had ever been to unlocking the terrible mysteries of the human soul. Beneath the asylum's polished corridors, where sunlight could not reach, lay a basement designed not for storage but for ritual. Here, Dr. Alcott created his most unsettling experiment, a chamber lined with clocks. Each clock face was stripped of its hands, their glass polished until they gleamed in the dim lamplight. Dozens of them circled the room like hollow eyes, frozen in a perpetual present. To the unknowing visitor, the sight was strange, but to Alcott it was perfection. He called it the Chamber of Prolonged Clocks, a place where time itself would be dismantled. Patients selected for this chamber were not the violent or unmanageable, but those who still clung to fragments of hope. He wanted minds that could feel the ache of waiting, hearts that still measured days in longing for freedom. They were led down narrow staircases into the chamber and seated against the stone walls. There were no beds, no windows, no lamps once the door closed. Only the gleaming clock faces and the dripping of pipes that echoed like an endless metronome. Alcott told them that they would remain until they could feel time itself. Then the heavy doors sealed shut, leaving silence to settle on them like dust. At first, the days were marked by thirst and hunger, relieved only by the slow drip of water from overhead pipes and scraps of stale bread shoved through a grate. But as the hours bled into one another, reality unraveled. The patients searched the clocks for meaning, hoping to see movement, hoping for even the shadow of a minute hand. Their eyes strained until hallucinations formed, faces emerging in the empty glass, hours they could not count twisting into grotesque visions. Some clawed at the stone, desperate to mark days by scratching tallies. But Alcott had chosen the walls carefully, hard limestone that yielded nothing to the fingernails. The torment was not of blood or blade, but of dislocation. Minds severed from the rhythm of hours drifted into a void where identity collapsed. A woman admitted for grief after losing her husband began reciting the names of her children in endless circles until the names lost meaning, and she fell silent, her lips moving without sound. A farmer who once measured his life by the rise and fall of seasons began to scream that the harvest would never come, his voice shattering into sobs that echoed against the glass faces of the clocks. They were alive, but already undone, suspended in a state that Alcott called pre-eternity. Weeks inside the chamber hollowed the body as well as the mind. Muscles atrophied from stillness, eyes grew clouded from the lack of light. The water from the pipes left metallic burns on the throat, yet they drank greedily because thirst was worse. Some tried to sleep, but without the cycle of day and night, slumber became terror. Dreams bled into waking visions until they could no longer distinguish reality from invention. Those who resisted longest did so by clinging to fragments of memory, whispering prayers or songs under their breath. But even these were eventually swallowed by silence. Alcott observed with cold precision, recording in his journal how long each soul could endure before breaking. Death in the chamber of prolonged clocks was rarely sudden. It came as a slow unraveling, a surrender not only of the body but of time itself. One man, a schoolteacher, sat with his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on a clock that had never moved. When Alcott opened the chamber after 37 days, the man's body remained upright, but his eyes were empty sockets where he had gouged them out with his own fingers, trying to stop the visions of endless hours. Another woman was found curled in the corner, lips blistered from licking the glass of a clock face, as if it could give her the minutes she no longer possessed. Each corpse removed from the chamber was carefully concealed. They were registered under false names, their bodies buried in unmarked soil behind the asylum. Letters were dispatched to families describing miraculous recoveries, tales of peaceful discharges into a life of quiet labor far from Illinois. These lies were spoken with such care that few ever doubted them. Parents believed their children had found work. Widows believed their husbands had been healed. The truth lay under the earth, nameless and devoured by time. For Alcott, the experiment was never about cruelty alone. He believed he had proven something profound, that when stripped of the measure of hours, the soul drifted into eternity. He called it learning eternity, as if the loss of time was itself a passage into revelation. He described their deaths as triumphs, their suffering as the purest form of discovery. He did not see corpses but proof. Each patient who perished became another step in his hidden doctrine, another verse in the scripture of silence and dislocation that he alone understood. And with each death, Alcott's conviction deepened. He had moved beyond the silence of chapter 1 and the ritual suffering of chapter 2. Now he wielded time itself as a weapon, a blade invisible yet absolute. He had begun to believe not only that he was uncovering the mysteries of the soul, but that he was reshaping eternity itself. In the aftermath of the chamber where time itself had been dismantled, Alcott sought a new form of ritual, one that replaced silence with sound but kept the same merciless order. He believed that if silence could dissolve identity, then endless sound could grind the soul into dust. Thus he opened another wing of the asylum, one hidden behind bolted doors where no visitor was ever permitted. Here he created his choir of hollow mouths, a grotesque experiment in forced devotion disguised as music. The patients chosen for this ritual were not the violent or hopeless, but the docile and fearful, those who might submit with the least resistance. They were told they were part of a sacred chorus, that their broken minds could be lifted to heaven if only they joined their voices together. But their lips were not free to sing. Alcott ordered their mouths bound shut with wire twisted cruelly through the flesh until only small gaps remained for breath. With their lips sealed, they could only hum. The sound was low at first, a trembling vibration rising from the throats of the terrified, but Alcott demanded more. He instructed them to hum as though their very souls depended on it, to weave their breath into harmony. Day after day, the sound grew stranger. It was not music, but a rasping drone that crawled through the corridors like an infection. The hums merged into a single ceaseless note, a sound that never ended because Alcott forbade any pause. No song was permitted to close. No prayer was allowed to reach its final word. Whenever a patient faltered, the wires were tightened, cutting deeper into lips until blood trickled down their chins. Some collapsed from exhaustion, but even then Alcott demanded they continue, forcing them to hum from the floor, dragging air through ruined throats until the vibrations tore at the lining of their flesh. Weeks passed, and the choir became less human with each sound it produced. The voices cracked, pitch dropped, and the once timid hum turned into guttural rasping that rattled the bones of those who heard it. Throats swelled and bled, cords shredded under the constant strain. Patients began to cough black clots into their laps, yet still Alcott urged the hymn onward, recording in his journal that the voices were approaching divinity. He saw holiness in their ruin, believing that endless song revealed a higher truth, that death itself could be tuned into harmony. The deaths came methodically, one after another, like notes falling from a song that refused to end. A young woman collapsed mid-hum, her throat split so violently that she choked on her own blood. She was dragged from the choir without pause, her body left in a corridor while the others were forced to keep the drone alive. Another patient, an elderly man whose lungs had weakened from tuberculosis, suffocated as his breath gave out, the wire cutting into his mouth as he thrashed in silence. His corpse, too, was removed without ceremony, as if he were only an instrument that had broken. Each time a body fell, Alcott replaced it with another patient, swelling the choir with fresh victims to ensure the sound never ceased. To the outside world, whispers spread of strange hymns rising from the asylum's walls at night. Local priests passing nearby spoke of holy devotion, of music that seemed too constant, too fervent to be of this earth. They told their congregations that the patients of the asylum must be offering praise to God without rest, a testimony of pure faith. None suspected that what they heard were not songs of worship, but cries strangled into ritual, voices bleeding under the command of a man who called their torment holy. For those trapped in the choir, there was no faith left, only the endless demand to hum until breath itself betrayed them. Their suffering was not wild or chaotic, but carefully measured, controlled, and prolonged. And for Alcott, this control was the essence of his vision. He believed he was crafting not music, but eternity, a harmony born of throats stripped raw, a symphony of voices that ended only when the bodies themselves could hum no more. For those whom Alcott deemed beyond cure, a separate ritual awaited, one that stripped not only time or sound, but the very idea of identity. He believed madness was not the disease of a broken mind, but the disease of a self that clung too tightly to its own reflection. If silence dissolved the will and endless hymns tore apart the voice, then distorted reflection, he reasoned, could erase the self entirely. In a long, narrow corridor below the asylum, he created his gallery of mirrors. Patients who entered were told it was a hall of healing, a place where they would see their true form. Instead, it became a hall of erasure, a tunnel where the final fragments of humanity were scraped away. The walls of this corridor were covered with mirrors, but not ordinary ones. Each sheet of glass had been warped and bent before mounting, turning reflections into grotesque parodies. Some mirrors stretched the body into monstrous length, others twisted faces into unrecognizable angles, and still others seemed to multiply a single patient into dozens of figures, all staring back at once. Yet the most devastating alteration was one Alcott reserved for those he wished to break quickly. He scratched away the silver at the place where a face should appear. When the patient looked into the glass, their body stared back, but their face was gone, smudged into a blank space that reflected nothing. The victims were stripped of clothing and led into the corridor naked, left alone in the company of their endless shifting reflections. At first, most reacted with nervous laughter or disbelief, pressing their hands against the glass, touching their cheeks to assure themselves they still existed. But as hours turned to days, the disorientation deepened. There was no window, no bed, no water but the trickle Alcott permitted through pipes in the floor. The mirrors became their only company, and company soon became torment. They searched for their faces in every reflection, only to find emptiness staring back. The effect was slow and cruel, like watching oneself vanish in fragments. The first to die in the corridor was a farmer's wife who had been admitted for depression. On her third day in the hall, she began scratching at her skin as though to carve a face she could no longer find. When her nails tore open her cheeks, she screamed, though the sound was muffled against the glass, swallowed by the cold stone. By nightfall, she smashed her skull against the mirrored wall until both glass and bone shattered, leaving a pool of blood that mixed with shards of her missing reflection. Alcott recorded the precise hour of her death in his journal, noting with calm satisfaction that her soul had been untethered from the self. Others followed in equally devastating ways. A schoolteacher gouged out his eyes with his fingers, whispering that if he could no longer see the missing face, perhaps it would return within him. He bled out slowly on the cold floor, his body surrounded by the distorted fragments of dozens of sightless selves. Another man, a blacksmith, hurled himself headfirst into the mirror, splitting his skull on impact, then dragged the jagged shards across his chest in a desperate attempt to carve proof of his existence before collapsing. Every death was methodical, every action born not of frenzy but of the unbearable weight of erasure. Alcott oversaw these scenes with quiet detachment. To him, each broken body was a page in a text he alone could read. He kept detailed notes on how long each patient endured before surrender, measuring hours and minutes as if tracking an experiment rather than lives. The moment of collapse, the precise breath, the final gesture, was what fascinated him most. He called it the moment of untethering, the instant where identity dissolved completely, leaving only the raw soul exposed. In those moments, he believed he stood at the edge of revelation, closer to unlocking a truth that had eluded every other physician and priest. Even the mirrors themselves were not discarded once broken. Alcott insisted that every shard be swept up carefully, each piece catalogued and melted down in the furnace beneath the asylum. The glass was recast into new mirrors, placed once more upon the walls of the corridor, ready to erase another life. In this way, the deaths of the patients were folded back into the ritual, their absence reforged as instruments of further torment. Nothing was wasted, not even their reflections. To the outside world, Alcott remained the compassionate director, admired for his lectures on Christian duty and the healing of the insane. Yet inside his asylum, he had created a factory of absence, a place where silence, sound, and reflection were stripped away until nothing remained. The Hall of Mirrors was only one chamber among many, but it revealed more than any other the truth of his vision. That to him, a human life was not sacred, but material to be dismantled piece by piece. The patients who entered the corridor never returned to the world above. Their bodies were dragged out under the cover of night, their deaths written as recoveries, their graves unmarked and their names erased. But their faces remained absent long before their bodies gave way. They had been erased, not by disease, not by madness, but by the methodical cruelty of a man who smiled in public and preached mercy while quietly turning reflection into annihilation. And with each erased face, Alcott grew more certain that he was closer to unraveling the mystery he sought. What remained when the self itself was destroyed? Beyond the mirrored corridors where faces dissolved, Alcott designed a chamber that would press directly upon life itself. He believed breath was the final refuge of the soul, the last involuntary defense of a body clinging to survival. To strip away sound or identity was powerful, but to make the very act of breathing into torment, this, to him, was the highest form of mastery. Thus he created the room of weighted breath, a chamber where existence was measured in painful increments, every inhale earned through suffering, every exhale surrendered with despair. Patients selected for this chamber were not violent or unruly, but ordinary men and women whom Alcott wished to test for endurance. They were laid flat upon wooden platforms, their arms pinned at their sides, their heads fixed against the boards so they could not turn. Over their chests, attendants lowered wide sheets of iron, adjusted with careful precision. These sheets were not heavy enough to crush immediately, but weighted so finely that the chest could still rise, though only with immense strain. Each breath became a labor, the lungs forced to work against the relentless burden. At first, the patients gasped, their eyes bulging in panic as they fought for air. Alcott would watch quietly, recording the rhythm of their heaving as though studying a machine. He did not allow screams or pleas to distract him. He only listened for the straining sound of breath scraping through constricted lungs. Hours stretched into days, and the bodies beneath the iron grew weaker. Muscles trembled from constant exertion, veins bulged against skin as if trying to burst free. Yet still the chest struggled to rise and fall. The simple rhythm of life became an agony without rest. Patients were given drops of water at intervals, enough to prolong suffering but never enough to ease it. Sleep offered no escape, for the weight allowed no true rest, each drifting into unconsciousness only to jolt awake in suffocating terror. Minds cracked under the monotony of their own breathing. The rhythm transformed into a sentence they could not escape. By the third or fourth day, the strain turned inward. The ribs, forced to bear the endless pressure, began to splinter. It did not happen all at once, but one by one, each fracture echoing faintly as bones gave way under the slow grind of fatigue. Alcott leaned close when he heard these sounds, describing in his journal the way the human body dismantled itself under the burden of survival. He wrote that each snap was not failure but revelation, proof that life was not extinguished in violence but surrendered piece by piece when forced against impossible weight. The deaths in the room of weighted breath were devastating in their slowness. One woman endured 6 full days, her body so emaciated that the iron plate pressed directly against the contours of her ribs. On the final night, she drew shallow gasps that could scarcely be heard. Her lips blew and cracked until at last the chest ceased to rise. Her stillness was absolute, yet Alcott recorded with satisfaction that her final breath had been measured against his device. Another man, a laborer admitted for melancholia, lasted only 3 days before his sternum caved with an audible crack. He gurgled weakly, his lungs flooding as bone pierced flesh, but even as his body convulsed, Alcott refused to intervene, writing that the experiment had reached its perfect conclusion. The attendants, though hardened by months of exposure to cruelty, found themselves shaken by this chamber more than any other. They were forced to carry out Alcott's orders, tightening the weights or adjusting them to prolong survival. But many turned pale at the sound of bones breaking under such quiet conditions. Yet none dared disobey. Alcott's authority was unshakable, his voice calm even as patients gasped beneath the sheets of iron. He convinced himself and his staff that this was not torture but science, a study of the will to live measured with the precision of pressure and time. For Alcott, the room of weighted breath became his masterpiece. It was not chaos or frenzy but controlled disassembly of life, each death slow, methodical, and complete. He believed the chamber had proven beyond doubt that survival itself was quantifiable, that the human spirit could be pressed until it broke like bone. Every body carried out from the chamber was buried nameless in the asylum's grounds, their deaths hidden behind false letters of discharge. But for Alcott, each grave was not a loss but a triumph, a step closer to the forbidden knowledge he craved. And so the asylum, once built as a monument to mercy, became a place where breath itself was turned into torment, where the act of living was transformed into its own execution. In Alcott's mind, the patients had not been murdered, they had been measured. By the early 1880s, Erasmus Alcott's reputation had spread far beyond Illinois. His name appeared in medical journals as a reformer, his speeches printed in pamphlets that reached Boston, New York, even London. The governor's office spoke of him with pride, holding him up as proof that Illinois was no longer a raw frontier but a state of refinement and progress. And so, when foreign dignitaries passed through the Midwest, Alcott's Asylum was presented as a cultural jewel worth seeing. It was not enough for Alcott to hide his horrors in silence anymore. He began to stage them, turning death into theater for those who held influence. The first of these visitors was Count Friedrich von Holzendorf, a Prussian noble whose interest in medicine and discipline made him a guest of honor. Alcott prepared the asylum days in advance, scrubbing the corridors, polishing brass fixtures, and lining the walls with fresh portraits of saints. The noble entered expecting a house of healing, but was instead greeted with a performance disguised as demonstration. Patients, selected with care, were driven into a chamber where the floor had been lined with burning coals. They were ordered to crawl forward, their hands and knees blistering as the heat seared through flesh. Alcott stood at the Count's side, speaking calmly of renewal, explaining that the pain was a rite of passage, that by walking through fire the patients shed their delusions. Von Holzendorf watched with fascination, mistaking their agonized convulsions for discipline. When one man collapsed midway, his skin blackened and peeling, attendants dragged him away into shadow, and another patient was forced to take his place. The noble applauded, impressed by what he called unflinching order. He never knew he had applauded an execution. Soon after came Lady Margaret Ashcombe, a wealthy English philanthropist seeking inspiration for her own charitable projects. She was led through the asylum like a guest through a cathedral, the staff rehearsed and silent, the air heavy with the hum of obedience. Alcott arranged for her to see a ceremony of rebirth, a grotesque spectacle in which patients were bound in soaking cloths and laid upon iron tables heated from below. As the steam rose and their skin blistered, Alcott described the process as cleansing, a purging of impurity through fire and water. Lady Ashcombe, unused to the brutality of such displays, interpreted their screams as a kind of devotion, their gasping as a desperate struggle toward health. She clapped politely at the conclusion, remarking on Alcott's brilliance, never realizing the patients she watched were carried not to recovery but to burial pits behind the asylum. For Alcott, these demonstrations served a purpose greater than cruelty alone. They were his shield. The applause of nobles and dignitaries became his armor, proof that what he did was not only tolerated but celebrated. Their words of praise were carried back across oceans and into salons where Alcott's name was spoken with reverence. Letters of recommendation followed, bringing donations from Europe that funded new wings, new instruments, new chambers of torment disguised as medical progress. Each coin given in admiration became a nail in the coffins of those who suffered unseen. The deaths in these demonstrations were as methodical as those in secret. Patients were chosen carefully, often the weakest, those whose bodies would collapse quickly under strain. Their suffering was rehearsed, their destruction presented as ceremony. The ashes of those who crawled across burning floors were swept into the earth without record. The charred bodies of those steamed upon iron slabs were carried to the furnace, their remains mixed into coal ash that was carted away at dawn. Not a trace remained. What endured instead were the polite lines in history books that noted how Lady Ashcombe and Count von Holzendorf had visited the asylum, praising its order and discipline. These records spoke of elegance, never of the smoke that rose from corpses still warm. In these moments, Alcott revealed his truest nature, not only as a man of hidden cruelty, but as one who could dress horror in the language of progress, who could turn torment into theater and execution into spectacle. The nobles left Illinois carrying with them memories of a brilliant reformer, their admiration ensuring that no inspector or judge would dare question him. And with their applause echoing in his ears, Alcott grew bolder still, convinced that his vision was not only unassailable but divinely sanctioned. By 1881, rumors began to crawl beyond the asylum's walls. Whispers of vanished men and women, of families who sent loved ones inside and never received a letter in return, reached the ears of officials in Springfield and eventually Washington. The asylum had become too large, its reach too visible for silence to hold forever. Inspectors were dispatched, men trained to sift through ledgers, to count names against bodies, to tally the living and the dead. But when they arrived, they found nothing. The archives, the heart of the asylum's history, had already been reduced to ash. Alcott had anticipated their coming. Weeks before the inspectors arrived, he staged what would be remembered as the Great Coal Room Fire. In the dead of night, attendants were summoned to carry boxes of files, admission papers, discharge notes, lists of burials, into the basement. There, under Alcott's watchful eye, the records were stacked high, dry tinder ready for spark. He claimed later that a loose ember from the furnaces had ignited the blaze, but in truth he lit the first flame himself, feeding it like a priest tending sacrificial fire. Thousands of names curled into smoke, patient histories that stretched across a decade, lifting into the air, drifting upward through the asylum's chimneys and out into the indifferent night sky. By dawn, the vault of memory was nothing but glowing cinders. When the inspectors questioned him, Alcott's face was a mask of sorrow. He spoke of tragedy, of how he had tried to save what he could but was too late. He led them into the basement, still reeking of smoke, showing them charred boxes, warped iron cabinets, ashes that sifted through their fingers. With calm precision, he explained how a spark from coal had leapt into the files, how the staff had battled the flames, how the patients had been spared only by quick action. The inspectors wrote their reports faithfully, never suspecting that what they had witnessed was not accident, but obliteration. Families who came searching for truth found themselves trapped in a deeper silence. A mother from Chicago demanded to know why her daughter's letters had stopped 2 years before. Alcott handed her a letter forged by his secretary, claiming her daughter had walked away from the asylum in health and sought work in another state. A farmer begged for records of his brother's death, only to be told the records had perished in the fire and that the man had most likely wandered free. The truth lay behind the asylum walls, where graves multiplied, shallow earth swelling with the bodies of those erased from history. The fire gave Alcott more than safety. It gave him perfection. With the names gone, there were no testimonies to contradict him, no dates to bind him, no records to expose the scale of his cruelty. The inspectors returned to Washington with empty hands, their suspicion dulled by his composure. Springfield's courts moved on to other matters, and society continued to praise his reform. Behind the veil of fire, Alcott stood untouchable. What remained of the patients was silence, sharpened into permanence. Their voices, already smothered in life, were now extinguished in death without memory. The families who mourned them did so in confusion, never certain whether their loved ones were alive or dead. The graves behind the asylum swelled like a secret no one dared to speak. For Alcott, this was the final refinement of his method. Suffering without record, death without witness, cruelty without consequence. The fire was not only the destruction of evidence, but the consecration of his philosophy, proof that even memory could be erased with enough heat. In Springfield's courthouses, the ash from the asylum's chimneys drifted unnoticed across polished stone steps, settling on coats and papers, staining the air with the faint smell of burnt parchment. No one realized they were walking through the remains of testimony, inhaling the last traces of names that no longer existed. The silence was perfect. No screams, no records, no trace of truth, only the faint gray dust of lives that had been transformed into smoke, rising into the sky and disappearing. For nearly a decade, Erasmus Alcott had stood as the master of silence, the conductor of endless hymns, the architect of erasure, the warden of weighted breath. He had controlled every moment, every ritual, every death with methodical precision, convinced that he alone could dismantle human life into its most secret parts. But evil corrodes even its keeper. By 1882, the cracks began to show, not in his asylum, but in the man himself. The same rituals he forced upon others began to mirror themselves back onto his own mind, until he could no longer tell if he was studying patience or becoming one of them. It began with his sleep. The director who once walked with impeccable posture, delivering polished lectures to officials, now paced his quarters through the night. His eyes grew hollow, ringed with bruised circles from weeks without rest. Staff whispered that he no longer closed his eyes because the moment darkness fell, the faces of the dead pressed themselves against him. He saw them in the corners of his room, lips still bound with wire, ribs caved from pressure, eyes gouged from mirrors. They stood in silence, then hummed in broken choirs, then clawed at the walls of his chambers with hands charred from fire. No amount of lamplight could drive them away. Insomnia became his constant companion, a torment he could neither measure nor control. Soon the hallucinations followed him beyond his quarters. Nurses reported hearing him muttering as he walked the halls, speaking in tones too low to catch, as though carrying on conversations with invisible companions. At times he raised his voice in argument, gesturing sharply to shadows no one else could see. One attendant swore she saw him stop in the mirror corridor, pointing to a scratched pane as if someone stood on the other side. His words echoed down the hall. "You are not untethered. You are still here." The staff avoided his gaze afterward, for his eyes no longer seemed fixed on the living but on the dead, trailing silently behind him. The more his grip faltered, the more the asylum itself seemed to recoil. Deaths continued, as methodical as ever, but now they bore the mark of haste, of frenzy. A man suffocated in the room of weighted breath sooner than expected when Alcott demanded the weight be increased too quickly. A patient in the choir of hollow mouths collapsed after days without pause, her body discarded as though Alcott needed to silence her sooner than she could break on her own. His journals, once filled with careful measurements of hours and breaths, now grew erratic, scrawled with phrases repeated again and again. They do not leave, they remain. They are waiting. When Alcott appeared in public, the mask that had shielded him for years began to slip. During a gathering of the Illinois State Medical Society, he took the podium as he always had, prepared to deliver a speech on moral reform in asylums. At first, his voice carried steady, rehearsed words that spoke of mercy and Christian duty. But midway, his hands began to tremble. He clutched the lectern, knuckles whitening as though unseen chains were pulling him down. Witnesses recalled how sweat poured from his brow, his voice cracking as if air itself had turned against him. He gasped between words, each breath shallow and strangled, until it seemed he was reliving his own room of weighted breath. Then, in front of doctors and dignitaries, Erasmus Alcott collapsed, his body convulsing in silence. Some swore they heard the faint sound of ribs snapping as he fell, though no one could say for certain if it was real or imagined. Rumors spread quickly after his collapse. Some claimed he had become one of his own experiments, his body now trapped in an invisible chamber of suffocation. Others whispered that the souls of the dead, untethered from their names and reflections, had returned to claim their tormentor. Within the asylum, the staff spoke of hearing footsteps in empty corridors, of wires rattling without touch, of a low hum drifting through the walls even after the choir had been disbanded. They said Alcott's madness had seeped into the building itself, that his collapse had opened the asylum to hauntings born from every silenced cry and broken body. His death was recorded with far less spectacle than his life. There was no grand funeral, no public mourning. His body was interred quietly, away from the eyes of those he had deceived for so long. The governor's office ordered his journals sealed, declaring them state property, hidden from the public to preserve the asylum's reputation. What became of those journals no one knows. Some say they were locked away in Springfield's archives, others that they were burned like the patient records, their words scattered as ash across the courthouse steps. But fragments of rumor claimed the pages still existed somewhere, scrawled with incoherent visions of voices that would not leave him, of faces erased but never gone, of breath counted long after lungs had failed. For the patients who still remained in the asylum, his collapse brought no peace. The system he built endured even after his body was lowered into the earth. The rituals continued under new administrators who mimicked his methods, too afraid or too corrupted to abandon them. The graves behind the walls swelled further, silence deepened, and families were met with the same lies of peaceful discharge. Alcott was gone, but the machine he created did not stop. The asylum, like its master, had become both executioner and ghost, carrying out torment even as the man who designed it decayed beneath the ground. The collapse of Erasmus Alcott was not a moment of justice, but a mirror of his own cruelty. He had dismantled others piece by piece until nothing remained. And in the end, he too was dismantled, not by the hand of law or morality, but by the echo of his own methods turning inward. His legacy, sealed in shadows and silence, was proof that evil does not vanish with the death of its keeper. It lingers, it spreads, it feeds on memory and fear. And in that asylum, long after Alcott's last breath, the weight of his vision still pressed down like iron, crushing every chest that dared to rise against it. When Erasmus Alcott's body was lowered into the earth and his journals sealed by the state, the asylum did not end with him. For another decade, it operated in the same shadows, feeding on silence, growing fat on secrecy. Patients continued to vanish. Graves multiplied behind its stone walls, and families were told the same rehearsed lies. But by 1894, the institution could no longer sustain itself. Funding dwindled, scandals whispered, and the walls themselves began to crack with age. The gates closed quietly, not in shame, but in administrative order, as if shutting down a factory. The great asylum was emptied, its records long gone, its wards silent once more. Within a few years, the building was dismantled for farmland, its stones carted away, its grounds plowed over until no trace remained. Corn grew where once voices had been bound with wire and lungs crushed under iron. To the world beyond Illinois, it was as though the asylum had never existed at all. For decades, silence held. Families aged into grief with no answers. Children grew old, never knowing what became of parents or siblings lost behind those gates. The graves lay untouched beneath the soil, unmarked, their bones pressed together under roots and stones. The state forgot, the towns forgot, and even those who had once worked inside learned to speak of other things. Alcott's legacy, crafted so carefully in silence, endured not through fame or honor, but through absence. Evil had done its work, and the land carried its weight without a word. It was not until the 1970s, nearly a century later, that the truth began to stir again. Construction crews digging foundations for a new road unearthed what the plows of farmers had missed, shallow graves lined with skulls that bore the marks of their torment. Some had wire still twisted through the jaw, binding teeth together even in death. Others showed fractures in ribs broken in the slow collapse of weighted breath. Fragments of shattered glass lay among them, the remnants of mirrors once used to erase faces. The bones spoke where the records had been burned, their silence now broken by evidence too stubborn to remain buried. News spread quickly through Springfield and beyond, shocking a generation that had forgotten the asylum entirely. Historians descended, piecing together fragments from letters, reports, and whispers carried across oceans. A handful of nurses' letters, written in trembling hands but never mailed, were discovered in dusty trunks by descendants. They told of chambers where patients hummed until their throats bled, of corridors where faces disappeared, of nights when the fires burned higher than coal alone could explain. Whispers from Europe reappeared too, memories of nobles who once applauded Alcott's demonstrations, their polite recollections laced with horrors they could not admit. Slowly a picture formed, not of a hospital, but of a machine of ritual torment masquerading as mercy. The discovery forced lawmakers to act, though their response came late and limping. Illinois passed new statutes forbidding asylums from destroying records, requiring unmarked graves to be cataloged and reported. It was a small shield against the possibility of another Alcott, a safeguard for memory if not for life. Memorials were discussed, debated, promised. Yet decades passed before a modest stone was raised, a marker so small that it seemed to vanish against the horizon of farmland. It bore no names, for none were known. It simply acknowledged the dead, the countless unnamed whose voices had been silenced and whose identities had been burned away. The legacy of the asylum was not one of reform or progress, but of absence. The lives lost were never fully restored to memory, never reclaimed in wholeness. They remained statistics without records, graves without markers, bones without prayers. And in that absence lay the deepest cruelty of Alcott's vision. Not only had he destroyed bodies, but he had destroyed the idea of those bodies ever having existed at all. His triumph was not in death itself, but in the erasure that followed. A silence so complete that even history faltered in trying to speak it. And so the story ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of concealment. Evil, history shows, does not always roar. It does not always scream in the streets or burn in visible flame. More often it thrives in stillness, in the quiet sanctioned by authority, in the order mistaken for care. Alcott's asylum proved that the worst horrors can hide behind polished speeches and the mask of reform. That the greatest cruelty is often carried out not in chaos but in method under the banner of duty. What remains is a question that echoes beyond the graves and beyond the farmland that now hides them. Could such silence return again? Could another institution, another polished reformer, another system cloaked in mercy but built on suffering, rise once more to erase lives while society looks away? The legacy of the unnamed warns that it is not only possible but inevitable if silence is left unchallenged. For silence is not absence. Silence is complicity. And in the end, the most haunting truth of the asylum is not that the patients died, but that they were never allowed to exist.